women's rights were never regarded as human rights, right? And violence against women was not recognized as a human rights violation. So the essence of this particular campaign that got started in 1991 by a group of women from the global south and some from the global north, feminist, I would say, with the team led by Charlotte Bunch at the Center for Women's Global Leadership, was to first increase awareness of violence against women, right? Secondly, to recognize that this violence is a human rights violation. That was the entry point to engaging the UN Human Rights Commission back in the day, right, to integrate gender and to recognize that women's rights are human rights, right? So when the First Lady of the United States in 1995, right, expressed these words, they were built, right, and echoed by women all over, and those who predominantly came in 1991 to move it forward, right? So I think it's kind of, that is one thing that I want to bring up. And the second is that when we think about women's rights as human rights, we must recognize that that holds economic, social, civil, political, and cultural realms where women must be present. Women's lived experience must be integrated, and women's agency that requires decision-making is accepted. So when we celebrate and recognize women's rights as human rights, that is what we mean. That we are everywhere and that people need to take us seriously. And even if they don't like us sometimes, right? And one of the things that happened on December 10th this year was to launch that a campaign must continue from 16 days to 365 days of the year, because women must be safe 365 days of the year, right? I want to give you 3 statistics that will help us kind of move this conversation forward. And I want you to hold those statistics, right? Men abuse women. There are 1.3 billion women who face violence in the hands of men. Men have killed 87,000 women as intimate partners in 2017. Men kill 137 women a day as their partners. That means roughly about 6 women per hour. And in the hour and a half we are together, there would be 9 women who will be killed by men. Right? And therefore, our work never ends. At the same time, we must really recognize awareness, action, and accountability 365 days of the year. The fierce urgency of now must be recognized in this time of post-COVID. And we are not talking about building back better. We are talking about building back differently. We are talking about building back in a way women's lived experiences with their intersecting identities are recognized and are central to the recovery. So with that, I'm going to turn to our panelists. We have an exciting group, and each of the panelists will take 5 minutes to give their free remarks, right? And I would really appreciate you holding to that 5 minutes. And then I have 2 questions for the panelists, and they will take 3 minutes each, right? And then we already have 1 question from the audience, and I will be looking to your questions, and it's going to be a conversation. It's going to be a conversation about celebrating women's strengths, and I see amazing faces there, and I hope you enjoy being with us and really engage. And this would be the beginning. Thank you. I would like to really like to hear from Irene. Irene, you have the floor.
Thank you, Krishanti, and hi everybody. I'm from Uganda, although I currently live in New Jersey, just outside of New York City, with my husband, who is a diplomat. So he's based at the Uganda mission to the UN for the past couple of years. Krishanti, please, when I've done 5 minutes, please just interject so I know that I need to wind up, because I'm a lawyer and I've also been a politician, and in both of those trades, talking a lot is allowed. So on this topic, women's rights and human rights, I've been involved in the women and human rights movement in Uganda for more than 30 years. Jumped into it right out of law school. And if there's one thing I'd recommend to any young woman who might be here, or who any of us work with, it is to get involved in voluntarism. It is to get involved with social movements, because through that, you learn a lot practically, you learn a lot intellectually, this depth that one gains from it, and you're able to connect the theory to practice. So what I want to talk about is really from my own learnings from that time, and I'll kind of try and link it to the topic. 2020 for all of us, I think, has been a year I look at as a year of exclamation points. We've had conflict, we've had crisis, we've had challenges. It's a year of reckoning for the many contradictions, as I see it, in a world that has largely gone mad. But then as I wrote that, I also thought about how for so many people in the world, it's just an addition to the troubles, the challenges that they live with every day of their lives. Many of these are women, many of these are poor. Some of the things that we've seen in this year, conflict from war happening all over the world, in politics, not least here in this country where I now live, social unrest, and also growing inequality. I think for me, the Black Lives Movement indicated clearly that unfinished business on racial justice and inequality will not wait. And it was quite gratifying to see that among the anchors of that movement are women, and especially young women, who have been growing the movement in their cities and in their communities. Of course, we see issues around climate emergencies and challenge the crisis of leadership in many countries. If you look closely at the kind of leaders, elected leaders, political leaders in a number of countries, and it seems to be growing, there is some commonality to many of them. And for me, when I look at leadership, political leadership today, I feel as if in many ways we are in the interwar period, the period that one learned about in history between the 2 world wars, and the kind of leadership that emerged in those times. And then, of course, we have COVID, which has put in question a lot of economic dogmas, particularly for me, those grounded in neoliberal ideologies. So the whole, COVID has for me just put out in stark relief the importance of things like public health, public services. Think about all the women who, when jobs opened up again, were not able to go because of issues around childcare. Think about the strain that many mothers face in their homes in managing virtual education from home alongside everything else that they need to do. So the whole question about the space for the public, the common good, public goods, that I think, and the way in which that had been undermined systematically for the past 30 years has been put into question by the COVID pandemic. And again, the role of the state against the role of markets. I'm raising this because one of the things I have found, and I have been involved in women's rights work in my country and in other places, including in some international spaces for many years, is that the focus for much of our organizing has been very much on the social and the political dimensions of women's human rights. Much less so for many on women's economic rights. And yet, as has been said, there's that intersectionality. You cannot have full empowerment in the social or political sphere without dealing with the economic. And I'm glad to see that increasingly today, in the past few years, in my country at least, more and more women are beginning to deal with the issue of women's economic context, women's economic situation. And in light of that, some of the work that I've done in the past 5 years, I was 5 years CEO of the Women Lawyers Association up until 2018. We still had a lot of issues that we're dealing with around violence against women, but we started increasingly to deal with issues connected to women's economic empowerment. And connected it to things like trafficking, and I'm glad Yvonne, I think you mentioned you work in trafficking, human trafficking, trafficking for sex and other issues, is a really huge issue for young women especially, but also vulnerable women. So women who economically are deprived quite often become the first targets, the first victims of things like that. But in my country, increasingly, and not just in Uganda and not just in Africa, but I think in many parts of the world, especially the global South, one of the major issues emerging are around the impacts of neoliberalism, of neoliberal policies, of opening up of our economies, and a dismantling of regulation of the economy. The impact of that on women's labor rights, on women's economic rights, on women's land rights is becoming more and more marked, and which really puts a strain on the right to development, but also the concept of mutual accountability, that I am my brother's keeper, I am my sister's keeper. Because we're seeing these tensions, this rolling back of rights for people in countries, especially countries of the global South, but increasingly as well, countries of the global North. If you think about the digital economy and the kind of impacts on the development of the gig economy and the kind of economic lives of people who work in that sector go through, the rolling back of rights for workers, the right to organize, the right of trade unions. All of these are things that we're seeing more and more. So for me, I think it's really important, if we're looking at human rights, to deal with the economic rights as well, and to look at structural issues. So looking at structural inequality, and in relation to women's economic rights, for me, the whole question of the global economic system and the global financial system and the impact of that on inequalities between countries and also increasingly within countries is something that I would say we need to work on much more closely. There are books that have examined some of these issues. Books like Kicking Away the Ladder, I think, are fantastic reads by Ha-Joon Chang that talk about the kind of policies governments need to have in order to achieve development, economic policies for economic development, and how global institutions like the Bretton Woods institutions, the World Bank, the IMF, and the kind of policies that they have pushed on countries through quote unquote structural adjustment policies, and now which are referred to as austerity policies, how those have increasingly deprived governments of the tools they need, the policy tools they need, and the resources that they need to drive development in their countries for their people, including women. The most affected by those kind of neoliberal policies have always been. And we see this more now with COVID, where you have this huge public health crisis. You see a lack of social security and lack of social programs, and women have to step into the gap. We see in many of our countries that women have to fill in because of lack of domestic resources, public resources gotten through taxation to support public services such as health or education or childcare. And so women have to fill that gap, even as they are the most affected. They are the first affected when jobs get lost, when economic opportunities for business or enterprise disappear. As we all know, or most of us know, more women who are in enterprise are in small and medium businesses. So I will just end by mentioning a number of spaces where some of these issues are being worked on, and where I would really call on more women to engage. One of them is at the UN itself, where we have a process called a panel that was set up earlier on this year by the President of the General Assembly and ECOSOC, a panel on financial accountability, transparency, and integrity. I'm a member of that panel, which is to deliver a report to the UN in February next year, that is examining the global financial system and the loopholes and gaps in that system. Some of the things that, just for us to get an idea about the things that we are talking about, 10% of world output is held in offshore financial assets. Our report, the interim report we had in September this year, found that $7 trillion of private wealth is hidden in mainly secret tax havens. And a number of these, I will say, are in the major financial centers of the world, in global capital countries. $500 to $600 billion annually is lost in global corporate tax revenue due to profit shifting by transnational corporations. And 20 to 40 billion yearly in bribes is lost in developing and transition economies. So we are talking about major global assets and wealth lost at a time of growing inequality, at a time when there isn't money in many cities and in many countries to support the kind of social services and economic investment programs that women need for their economic empowerment. It is really important for us as women to deal with these global inequities in the global financial system, and to find ways of dismantling structural inequalities between countries and within countries.
Thank you so much.
Lastly, just to say that the areas that these are found are tax, trade, and which drive them are around tax, trade, and international relations, and they often is as well. How do I put this? The impacts are felt by everybody. Everybody loses. I like to call the 99%, but developing countries are hit the hardest by this. So there is an element to it which is also based on where one is located in the world. So I will end here, and if there are any questions that come up in this area, I'll be happy to take them. It's a form of violence, and we need to deal with it too.
Thank you very much. I think, Irene, I'm so glad I started with you. There are a couple of things I wanted to take from your presentation before we move on to Margaret. I think it's really important to recognize that when we talk about human rights, that it includes economic, social, and cultural rights, and civil and political rights. It's also very important to recognize that during COVID, 97% of unpaid and paid care work is done by women right now, right? Mm-hmm. So which means we are kind of doing 3 jobs in a day. Mm-hmm. And 70% of frontline workers who are healthcare workers are women, right? It's also important to recognize, though, my entry point was violence, that violence is an indicator of gender-based inequality and discrimination. And discrimination is not an accident. It is a deliberate form of exclusion, right? And when we are looking for answers, I want to go back to what was said, that it is really important to recognize unpaid care work, because the majority of world's women, predominantly of the global south, right, fall into that category, which means that social protection is essential when we are thinking about recovery. And we also have to recognize, because very beautifully Irene brought this up, that really the macroeconomic policies, the labor policies and financial policies, global policies were really developed to benefit continuing colonialism, right? That was transformed to neoliberal politics and economics, right? So with that, I want to go to Margaret. Margaret, you have the floor and 5 minutes. Thank you. Margaret?
Am I unmuted? Can you hear me?
Yes, perfect. Thank you.
Good. Well, hello, everyone. And I'm really honored and grateful to be given the floor. I think I've only got 5 minutes, so I'm looking at my watch. What a year it has been. On the one hand, by the way, I'm Margaret Owen. I'm a lawyer. I'm the president of Widows for Peace Through Democracy. I've been going to the CSW for ages, and I think I'm only one of the very few women still alive who's been to all 4 World Women's Conferences, the last one, of course, Beijing. But I'm saying what an incredible year it has been this year, on the one hand, for birthdays. Birthdays for human rights that we've been celebrating. And I'm talking to you now when we've come to the 16th day of that whole work on trying to eliminate violence against women. So it's the 71st birthday of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. We've got the birthday of the CEDAW 41 years ago. We've got the 20th birthday of 1325. We've got all these birthdays that we're supposed to be celebrating. 1993, the Vienna Declaration on the Human Rights of Women. And yet this is the awful year when we're actually seeing an unbelievable and horrific increase in violence against women in every country in the world, including my own country here in the UK. We've seen the most appalling exploitation and brutality towards women, which has been exacerbated by armed conflict, and conflicts and wars are always decided by men, by powerful men, but it's the women in conflicts who suffer disproportionately. But now we've got COVID-19. And in every country in the world, including my country, COVID-19 has horribly exposed the sort of inequalities that my wonderful colleague from Uganda and has just spoken about, and Yvonne as well. The terrible inequalities which have made women even poorer. In the COVID-19 lockdowns, more and more women have suffered the most terrible and violent abuse. I think I've only got 5 minutes and I've already done 2. I think we all know how bad it is for women, that whilst we're celebrating all these birthdays, at the same time, and we've noticed it at the CSW in the last few years, we're now having to fight like mad to stop the pushback on women's rights. We really are threatened now with women's rights going back another 50 years. And why is this? It's because globalization, but also a huge rise now in authoritarian regimes that actually pour scorn on international standards, on international laws, international rights. The terrible example of this is our very fine UN Secretary General at the UN, Antonio Guterres, who is a great supporter for women's gender equality and women's empowerment. He asked nearly a year ago for a global ceasefire so that all countries could come together and tackle this terrible pandemic. And they poured scorn on that. And we have more and more authoritarian regimes waging war. And we have the appalling arms trade, which impacts so terribly upon women. And at the same time, and remember, I'm very old now, and I've been coming to the CSW for some 27 years. I have watched, and maybe you all have watched, a really sinister shrinking of the space for civil society, and particularly the space for women's NGOs, particularly the silencing of the most disadvantaged, of the women who are really left behind in every country, the poorest women, the refugee women, IDP, disabled women, old women, and I have to say, and this is my chance to say, and the widows. I think if I talk about widows, it's a very good example of how the most disadvantaged, the most powerless women, the most exploited women still have no voice. There has been an unbelievable increase in the numbers of widows of all ages. And let's dispel the myth that widows are mainly older women respected by their families. That's not true. There are millions of uncounted child widows. And in all these wars that happen, and rape is now a weapon of war, what happens in wars? Divide the men and boys from the women and girls, kill the men and boys, rape, and bring into sexual slavery the women and girls. So wars have made many, many millions of widows who have no voice. And even in peacetime, widows suffer, as my friend from Uganda will know, suffer incredible deprivation of human rights and injustices. They often have no right to inheritance, no right to own land, no right to property. They might be victims of appalling tortures under mourning and burial rights and harmful traditional practices.
Thank you so much.
And I think that it's very important. I want to come quickly to solutions. It's terribly important. We talk about no political will. They have all these laws, all these international laws, but there's a huge gap between the lip and the cup, and there's no implementation. 1325 was a great moment when we thought we'd hear women's voices at the peace tables, but actually you don't hear widows at the peace tables, and very few national action plans to implement 1325 even mention widows. I talk about widows because it's an extraordinarily vehement example of how the most disadvantaged women's voices are never heard. And I think what we need is a real feminist foreign policy, in which we all come together and we fight in our own countries that actually there should be 50-50 women and men at every single decision-making body, whether it's national or local, or even international? Wouldn't it be great if we had co-chairs everywhere? Co-chairs of men and women at the Security Council, co-chairs at the International Criminal Court, co-chairs. I keep thinking, and then I must stop. Look, please, all of you, if you don't know about it, the Kurdish model of Rojava, northeast Syria, the women's revolution in Rojava, where every single decision-making body has co-chairs. We've got to stop this world being run by dreadful, patriarchal, white, probably mainly white men. We need much more diversity. We need women in decision-making. Thank you.
Thank you. On that note, we will move. Thank you very much for that passionate presentation. I wanted to catch a few things that Margaret said before moving on to Goha. I want us to recognize that there are two pandemics, right? There are two pandemics. One is COVID. The other one is gender-based violence, right? That is the indicator because it stems up because of inequality and discrimination. And only one of these has a vaccine at this moment, right? It shows the political will of who is in charge. Because we have a low tolerance for COVID. Therefore, the world has been working 24/7 to come up with a vaccine. And we have a very high tolerance for gender-based violence. So hence, there's no political will. As Margaret said, there are lots of extraordinary declarations, treaties, and it lacks the will to implement because we have the language, we have the thinking, we have the policies, right? And I think that is where we need to hold our feet to the fire. And I am in the United States, and I'm very sad to report this statistic before I moved to Goha, that in 2016, President Donald Trump received 50% of white women's vote. And in 2020, President Donald Trump received 52% of the white women's vote. So our job around holding feet to the fire and really demanding political will, I think, is right now is the most urgent that we have ever seen. And I move on now to Goha, and you have the floor and 5 minutes. And I will, so what I want to do is on my screen, I'm going to put a clap on the side, a symbol, and then you would know that your 5 minutes are up. Thank you so much. Over to you, Goha.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation and for this great panel, for these discussions. I will continue what you said, Krishanti, about not being tolerant to many problems that we have in the world. And one of them is war that we're experiencing now in Armenia, as if COVID was not enough for 2020 that hit everyone so severely. On September 27, a war started in Armenia on the borders of Armenia and Azerbaijan. And I want to talk about the context that women and girls live now in our region, in the country. And it became so bad that even talking about gender-based violence now is not a priority because we have a population of displaced women and girls. And we have a lot of really like mental health as well issues, as well as economic, of course. So I wanted to present the situation and raise the voice on behalf of these women that we work with and support. And the context that we live now is really very uncertain and chaotic, because the war started on September and technically ended on November 9th, but still there are a lot of uncertainties and problems with the territories, and of course, which is the most important, is with the displaced population. Right now, there are some estimations that 100,000 displaced people came already to Armenia. They are on the Armenian territory, and the majority are women and girls. And we are basically, the only thing we can do now is provide humanitarian aid and also social psychological aid. So I wanted to just highlight what changed, in my opinion, in these 2 months drastically in the lives of many of us, but especially those women and girls affected by the war. We witness now that drastic changes of the roles of women, as it's obvious after the war and armed conflict. There are a lot of women who, just now Margaret was mentioning, widows and single mothers. So we're having more of these groups of women now in our region, in our country especially. And women are once again, after COVID, they already were the primary caregivers, but now they're becoming even like double, triple burdened by this care that they should provide to their families, because many of them are left basically as the main breadwinners. And we're now doing a needs assessment among women living in the shelters and just being displaced and just left without homes. Mainly, they lost their jobs, but also some of them, they work from home, and now there is no home for them to work, basically. So many contexts, so many settings are changed, and accordingly, of course, the roles and the responsibilities are added once again on women. And what we witness, women are becoming also, that they are psychologically devastated, heartbroken, but also they kind of taking this role of healers, because they have to take care of others. And once again, we see women are now becoming these psychologists, social workers. And so it's hard for me now to estimate the level of the damage that is done, but this is what we see now, and this is what we think that we should raise in front of international community as well, and just to educate what's going on, and of course to take examples of other wars, unfortunately, and learn from how we are, how we have to go forward from here, what we should do in order to mitigate this damage on all levels, human, social, economic. But also, I think what is once again, this type of conflict and emergencies, crises shows that when women are completely excluded from any negotiation and peace talk, and that was the case in our war for this so-called frozen conflict for 30 years, this is what we experience. This is what we have now. Once again, women are taking this burden of failed negotiations, failed, basically, failed wars from instigated by men, because we were never there in the first place to discuss anything about this conflict. And those of us who were there to speak about peace were so brutally attacked by nationalists. And I know the same was in Azerbaijan. Anybody who was talking about peace, they were, scrutinized and put as like enemies of the nation, basically. And especially when it's women, especially when this is the women's organizations who are raising taboo issues of sexuality, and now also talking about peaceful resolution of conflict. So I think this type of conflicts and emergencies this just shows how vulnerable we are, how vulnerable women's organizations are also in working with trying to help other women and girls. Because if we are attacked, if we can't do our work, then it's really becoming even more dangerous for others affected by the war. And now, once again, we were witnessing, unfortunately, these attacks from anti-gender, anti-human rights movements, which is they're everywhere in the world. But whenever there is this type of crisis, they're even taking more on, especially when now it's a right time for them to once again raise this militarized rhetorics and talk about patriarchy and how important nationalism is, and all these, very, very dangerous things that we have been experiencing already before, prior COVID and war, but now they're becoming even more, these tendencies becoming more visible. And
thank you.
Yeah, thank you. It's 5 minutes.
And I would really
already.
appreciate you can, I think when I'm asking the next two sets of questions to bring your thinking back. I'm sorry for the war. I'm a product of war myself, as well as a lot of love. I'm originally from Sri Lanka, and we had a civil war within the country for 27 years. And I think it's important to recognize that we see women's lives get negotiated, right, in the battlefield, right, and in every place else. Then we must ask the question, if women are the most vulnerable in times of war, what does it mean for us in times of peace? If in times of peace we are not safe and 1.3 billion face violence, then we shouldn't be too surprised that war takes us on, right? And I think that is an important reminder as to how much we have to do and why it is really important to have the right women in leadership. I wouldn't say all women. I would say the right people and the right women. So what I'm going to do now is to really ask our panelist a question, and I'm giving them roughly now, I had said 3 minutes. So keep your responses even shorter than that so that we can move through. And I want to welcome questions from the audience, and I will combine some of them and present. And my first question to the panelists is, when building back differently post-COVID, where do you see the entry points to center women's human rights within systems and structures? I am talking about economic and financial, health, governance, right? Labor, like any of those structures, what are the entry points for women's human rights? And I will start with you, Irene.
Thank you. Yeah, very good question. What are the entry points? What are the solutions? I think for a start, that for any solution to happen, we have to start with ourselves. So in two ways. One is around how do we organize and mobilize ourselves? This is something that we've been discussing in Uganda for many years in civil society and the women's movement in the context of shrinking civic space. So how do you organize? How do you mobilize? And we had to remind ourselves that while we were either working in NGOs or part of social movements, we were citizens. And so claiming citizenship and all of what that means meant educating ourselves, understanding our context, linking up with each other at that level of interpersonally. So that for me is, I think, is the starting point for women and people working on women's human rights, organizing and mobilizing. And so educating ourselves, understanding the issues, building the networks, reaching out. And for the reaching out, it's really important that we break out of silos. quite often we work in particular silos. So you'll have, lawyers working together, or people working on tax justice working together. We need to go beyond that and link up the different communities engaging on things. And we have to also deal with the hierarchies that we have within them. And we've talked about that, whether it's hierarchy based on color, based on race, based on other issues, differences. It may be status, like widowhood and, and age and so on, ethnicity. So all of these, and the class. One of the things which unfortunately I find in many of our social movements we don't talk about enough is the issue of class. Quite often I think it's because a lot of us who find ourselves or have the time, even on resources, to be in these spaces are middle class. So those, the poor from the poorer classes often just cannot get involved in these spaces. They don't have the time or the resources. So the issue of class as well. And we need to break those kind of hierarchies in who we link up to, in how we organize, in the leadership in our social movements. When I was in FIDA, one of the things we deliberately set out to do was to work with women in labor. So women working in the horticultural sector, for example, poor, poorly educated and so on, worked with them. And we found so many strengths in organizing and mobilizing that they brought in. They looked at the issues very politically, not just technically, as lawyers typically will. So there are strengths that those other groups bring in. And in terms of the spaces, I think the entry point is we need to. I hope I'm responding correctly. One is to have just to keep track of what is happening and what are the opportunities that open up. So those may be in multilateral spaces, like I mentioned about the UN process. It might be at a regional level in regional institutions and processes. So just kind of tracking. Not everybody will have the time or the wherewithal to do that, but there may be people who, by virtue of where they're located, might be in an international NGO or something, they have the resources to track and see opportunities as they emerge. Some of these come from landmarks, like next year there's going to be the Angus. So how do we target that and connect some of the issues we're pushing for? Or there'll be CSW. How do we connect to that? Those kind of landmarks, and those can happen at international or regional and also local level, within our countries. So those are some of the things I'd look at as entry points. Last thing, in all of the work that we do, we have beneficiaries, people who benefit from the status quo. In the kind of work I do, the area I work around economic rights and tax justice, those are quite often hidden. They're called multinational corporations. We need to unpack the people who benefit from the status quo and find ways of highlighting what they do and how they contribute to maintain the current system. Who benefits from violence against women? Who benefits from war? And target them as well. I think those are some of the entry points we have to think about very practically and holistically.
Thank you very much. Margaret, the question to you. Same question.
I'm trying to unmute. That doesn't unmute.
You're muted, Margaret. Margaret, you're muted. You need to unmute yourself. All right. So I am going to Goha. Could you respond to that question until Margaret unmutes? Thank you.
Thank you. Very, very good and difficult question, of course. I think that an entry point right now, at least based on our work, is work with adolescent girls. This is what I see as a great opportunity to start these conversations, because we see a lot of changes that are happening among adolescent girls, and I think we have to include them as much as possible in our conversations, because very often there are so many creative and interesting ideas, and their entry point is very different sometimes from our entry point. And I think it's a very good opportunity now to be engaged in the conversation with them. This is what we do, and I see a real change here. I see how many great ideas and grassroots initiatives are emerging from the conversations with them. And I think that this is, for me, at this point, this is one of the basically, I don't know, like opportunities, entry points to start the conversation about women's rights, because it's very difficult to talk within an educational system, for example, or within the with the government, with other entities. But I think mobilizing grassroots initiative, grassroots groups, especially among younger generation, this is always a very exciting thing to do.
Thank you very much.
No, I'm
Margaret, we are
unmuted.
coming to you.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Perfect. Thank you.
Right. Entry points. First of all, number one, let's really harness the huge and gigantic sources that there are in the solidarity of an international sisterhood. I mean, this is incredible. There are far more women in the world than there are men. And we, I think, women are much more like sisters than men are like brothers. And actually, it is deep. I talk again about the huge inequalities, both within countries and between countries. And I think it's important that we who live in more developed and better off countries, and countries where women have freedom of expression and can't be beaten up or imprisoned for what we say, speak on behalf of those women in countries who are not allowed to speak. There are all sorts of ways and entry points to help, like, for example, in this country, all the women in this country and men, because we need men with us, ought to be stopping the sale of arms to these countries where they use our arms to oppress and kill and widow their own populations. I also think there are entry points at the Security Council in its context of the Women, Peace and Security Framework, and the area meetings, which are meetings that the Security Council holds for CSOs. I think it's really, really important that we actually get the funding right. How can these women's NGOs in countries where they're allowed to operate manage to articulate their needs and describe the roles they need support on? We've been talking all the time about the unpaired parents, the sole parents, unless they have funding. We also, another entry point is to really look at actually developing a completely new system of funding that actually is manageable and that can actually help women to have a voice. There's lots that we can do as women, but we need to have men and boys on our side. And we who live in better off countries have a responsibility to support and help through our own aid programs. We shouldn't be giving aid to any country. It has conditionality unless we can see that they're actually implementing all these international laws which are there to support women. I can't talk anymore, there's no time, but there are lots of entry points, and we are strong because we are women.
Thank you, but I think you're bringing an important point that is quite contentious, actually. So I want to put that out there. No country actually treats its women as well as its men, right? So I think we need to first recognize that we are in the same mess, right? And the other thing, actually, Margaret, I'm really going back to you because you brought up something that you talked about feminist foreign policy and you talked about arms trade. Very true, right? And I wanted to combine these two and challenge all of us. There's a woman by the name of Lujan Al-Khattu in jail in Saudi Arabia, speaking up, right? And she has been in jail for 3 years. Human Rights Watch has taken on her case. Amnesty International has. We have, everyone, in the women's human rights community at large understands this, right? And right now they have expedite trial, right? So we have Sweden with a fantastic so-called feminist foreign policy agenda. Saudi Arabia, it's one of its largest arms dealers. What is the role of Sweden then, right, in ensuring the release of Lujan, right? So I think we have to, we cannot take for granted the terms that we hear unless they are very strategically, consciously, and deliberately have positions of value and action. So perhaps with one of the feminist foreign policy deals should be to ensure that the protection of women's human rights defenders globally, that so-called feminist foreign policy governments do not trade, right? Because you can't trade arms on one hand and then claim what you want from that particular country are a group of women related to the men in power, right? So I think as feminists, this really puts us in a tough and a bold place, right? And I think that is very critical for us to kind of push forward. And so my next question to the three of you is sort of related to that. And I want to really ask you, how do you draw a distinction between feminist and human rights leadership? So again, I will start with you, Irene, with 2 minutes now.
Well, I think when I think of feminists, I think of the values that are grounded in recognizing women's equality to men, and in challenging the systems and structures that keep women at a lower level, that treat women differently, that deny women their power. So that's what I think about when I think about feminism. And human rights, I think, really fits within the broader human rights, the human rights framework and the framing of issues in terms of the social, economic, and political rights that men and women have. Now, within the human rights framework, there is a recognition, from the Vienna Declaration, Vienna Treaty, around women's rights are human rights. So that was within the framework, and we have a number of instruments like the CEDAW, the CIVO, and others, that relate to women's human rights specifically, looking at how women should have equal rights in all these spheres of life. But in terms of the practical work around that, you often find that these two communities are different. The feminist community tends to be much more political in its work, to recognize clearly the role of power in relationships and in inequality, while the human rights community tends to be much more technical. And actually there's a criticism of it as well from writers like Naomi Klein, around the depoliticization of human rights work. I'm in both of these, and I see the strengths, and so you find things like solidarity are quite strong in both, but especially on the feminist side. I think you can, and you don't have to be a woman, in my understanding, to be feminist. So I really agree with what you said earlier on when you said we need to have the right women, and being a woman doesn't necessarily mean you're a feminist either. Mm-hmm. So I really think it's important. And when you look at leadership and we talk about feminist leadership, it's important to have women and men in positions of leadership who believe in the equality of both genders, of the genders. So yeah, while you also do need the understanding, from a technical perspective of human rights, of the commitments around them, things like what role the state has to play in ensuring respect and protection and so on of people's human rights. Yeah, I don't know whether I've answered your question, but just trying to see how I look at the difference.
Thank you, but I will, when I close this, I will come back to you. Is what on what you said. I think Gohai, would you be able to respond to this? Like, you know, do you draw a distinction between women, you know, women's leadership and feminist leadership? Because I think we sometimes use it interchangeably in the women's community at large, and I want, you know, the three of you as experts and engaging on a daily basis to really bring that out and to kind of explain
Thank
to the
you.
audience.
Yeah,
Thank
it's
you.
a question that we always discuss in our community. And for me, feminist leadership is, first of all, based on feminist solidarity and feminist philanthropy, values and principles that unfortunately sometimes I don't see at human rights community. As it was mentioned, human rights communities is very often very technical, and it takes human rights in a very instrumentalized way. While feminist community, I think it's living women's rights. It's through our lives that we're coming to this idea of what is a feminist leadership. And I think feminist leadership is just the opposite. Very often is a challenge for mainstream human rights organization, because often we have this even, you know, contradictions and a lot of heated discussions about differences in our approach in the leadership approach, in so what is solidarity, what is feminist support, etc. And I think it's feminist leadership actually is deconstructing very often mainstream human rights leadership and trying at least to make it richer, to make it more inclusive and diverse. So of course there are some commonalities, that obviously they are, but at the same time I think that it's time for human rights communities, leadership to recognize the value of feminist leadership, because it only can make it richer, really, our work and our joint cause.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. A lovely way to move on to you, Margaret.
Right. Here I am again. Sometimes I think I'm not a real feminist at all, because when you look at the women leaders we've had Margaret Thatcher, we've had Theresa May in our country, hasn't done much for women. But what I really want, and again, I'm probably echoing what Gohar and our Ugandan friend has said as well, that we really need to, there are a lot of serious men all over the world. There are a lot of men who understand that you can't have human rights, you can't have democracy, you can't have freedom unless you have gender equality, women's empowerment. And so I really want, I have to go back to Rojava, where I've been 3 times. That's an incredible model, a model for everyone all over the world, where everywhere you have these co-chairs, men and women, from the army to the police to the courts, down to the village, down to the factories, in the universities, even in the defense forces. Always let's work with men. We also need men and boys to understand how violence against women is absolutely unacceptable, and for them to understand that you only have a free and just society when you have that women's empowerment. So in a way, I think that, I mean, that's what I would go for all the time in this country as well. I think it's an amazing idea, the Kurdish idea of co-chairs and co-leaderships. I'd like to see all of you from whatever country you are in, think about starting in the cities and having co-mayors, a man and a woman in your cities. Somehow start this idea We need men on our side, and there are lots of men who are on our side. Let's get there like that. So
Thank you.
about women's leadership, I want women co-leadership with men. That's what we need. Thank you.
So thank you. So I think, so I want to really tackle first to, what Irene and Goha has brought up, because we want feminism, and we recognize that feminist leadership includes all genders, right? So that is a very important distinction, and we don't live in a binary world, and I think it's important to recognize that. And we are a continuum, actually, right? And then it's also really important I mean, when I started, I talked about 1991, and it's only in 1993 that the UN system recognized women's rights are human rights, and that's not too long ago, unfortunately, right? So the human rights mechanisms still need help, right? So I think this is where the women's human rights mechanisms, that includes the special rapporteur on violence against women, the UN working group on discrimination against women and girls, in discrimination against women and girls, right? As well as the CEDAW committee come into play. So I think we need to bring them on more and work with them. I think what is also very fundamental is bridging feminism and human rights. So actually, at the Center for Women's Global Leadership, we call ourselves a feminist human rights organization, so that we ensure that feminism is central, and we have values. We share 3 values under feminism, which is agency. So women, everyone has the right, and women certainly have the right to decide about their lives, their families, their communities, and their nation, right? There is inclusion. So an intersectional approach is very important for both feminism, and while feminism might hold that in place, definitely for human rights, right? So recognizing the multiple and intersecting identities of not only individuals, but also of communities, right? And the third value is solidarity. And solidarity is about transcending borders. And I think in this, we need to really pause and give the flow and recognize the voices of women of the global south and women who are from marginalized communities of the global north, right? It is their leadership, their lived experiences that will really, if we are believing in transformation, would transform global policy. Because if the women in the margins are at the center of decision making, then everyone is included in that, right? So I think that is something for us to carry. And I want to, so there's a lot of chat and movement, and also Margaret brought in a lot around men, right? And I think there are many schools of thought. So I want to follow up with each of our panelists around just not including, it's not our responsibility to handhold, yet it is important to partner, right? And it is most important to hold each other accountable, right? Men have been trying to hold women accountable for all kinds of stuff. And I think we need to step up our game on accountability. So I want to hear from the 3 of you about the role of men and how you have worked with men, right? And where you have seen moving forward and where you have seen challenges. And actually, Margaret has already spoken to this. So I want to really hear from Irene and Goha about it. Irene?
Thanks. I think that's a very interesting discussion on some of the points that you've made, around feminist values, and it's good for us to remind ourselves, from time to time, and absolutely I agree with what Margaret said about not every woman leader is the one you'd want to have, so the values are really important. So some of my lessons in the work I've had and in leadership positions. So either at when I was at ActionAid, I was an international board chair, and also when I was in Parliament, in the regional Parliament in East Africa, those were leadership spaces, and lessons for me. So in the Parliament, we were 9 women out of 27. This was a regional Parliament, so similar to the EU for 3 countries. And so, of course, we were a minority, and we had to work with men. Men were the majority. The men were in more powerful positions, and we had to. And so I had to learn about how to work with men in those kind of spaces. One thing I'll say is that it was one of the most disempowering spaces I have been in. As a woman, and I went in there after decades of work in the women's movement. One of the most disempowering spaces, but at the same time, one of the spaces where I felt I could do a lot more, because it was a decision-making space, and a space that had authority over policies affecting about 110 million people. So some of the lessons are around partnering, around finding men who see the value in supporting feminist causes. Some of the things that I tried to push in there were things like how to ensure that the regional integration process was much more inclusive. So marginalized groups, pastoral communities, fishing communities, women's movements, civil society, that those should be brought into the decision making and into the policy of the East African community, and not just focus on the big business. So look at small enterprises and so on, where a lot of women are located. So I had to learn to work with men. I had to find men within the system, whether it was the speaker or whether it was men who, because of their status, maybe former ministers and things like that, within that space, had a voice that would be listened to. So being able, but identifying allies among them. The other thing I also found very useful was to bring expertise. So on the kind of issues that one would work on, in that case, it was issues like trade, international trade negotiations and so on. I had to make sure that I had read ahead, I was well versed in the issues, and so I brought in technical expertise, which they then found themselves relying on. I used my networks, because I had networks from civil society connecting to, ActionAid and Oxfam and all sorts of groups. So bringing in that kind, harnessing the networks and leveraging that, and using that to advance a more progressive and more inclusive agenda that I had, including ensuring that the community and the parliament, the regional parliament, linked up to groups that traditionally would not have been the focus of their policies and of their work. From the other one, the ActionAid, the international NGOs, international spaces, the challenges that one often gets in those spaces is hidden hierarchies. Hidden hierarchies based on power, in some cases based on race, in some cases based on funding. Financing was mentioned here as an issue. So you will find that even in spaces that are
we just lost
spaces
you,
meant to
Irene.
be inclusive and so on, money.
I'm sorry, Irene, can you?
Sorry, I'll wind up. Bring in hidden power.
No,
Sorry?
actually, we couldn't hear you. I just wanted you to repeat what you said last. Yeah.
Okay, so I said, so often you'll find in our own spaces, and by our, I'm talking about all of us. So these spaces of social movements, spaces of civil society, where the certain values, the values that you talked about, are actually meant to be the foundational values of our work. You will sometimes find the hidden power and hierarchies that the values that don't represent the values, but you find them, and they may be based on race, they may be based on financial power, so in a body that has in a body that has an institution that has countries or programs and so on, which have different levels of financing, those with more money often will have more power. So the power of money, the power of those sort of differences, and also of gender, So I found that what helped me as an international chair of an international federation, where some of those issues were there, alongside the more inclusive way of work that other people demonstrated, I found that I had to identify what I called in my mind the like-minded. So I would always look out for the like-minded. Who are people who share the values, and so that I could work based on values and connect to people across region, connect to people across north and south, and across countries and ethnicities, and so build up coalitions of people who have the same progressive agenda, same progressive goals. I guess it's similar to some of the stuff I did with Iniela as well. So I think those are, for me, are some of the things. So you have to understand, first of all, for yourself, who you are. What's your compass? What's your value? And then what is the purpose of being in a space like that? What is the agenda that you have? So you have to have an agenda you bring in, build up your understanding of the issues being worked on there, and deepen your expertise in those issues, and then find and build the alliances and so on with the groups, with the others who are there that have the same purpose, same agenda.
Thank you.
For me, that is what has worked in working with men, and the same in civil society in Uganda as well. So working with men in different spaces, very political spaces, in international civil society, and also at a local level in civil society.
Thank you. So I have I want to go to Goha, and then I have one other question to wrap up. Okay, Goha.
Thank you. I don't have much to add because Irene summarized everything so in such a wonderful way. I also think that we have to continue what we're doing, and just if there are men that want to join our movement, they're very welcome. But I don't think that we have to reach out to them specifically and to include them and to encourage them to be part of our movement, because this is unfortunately what very often I see among some organizations, this urge to reach out to men, to include them, to work with them. I think we're doing enough already. And if there are men and boys that are interested in our work and want to be our allies, they're very welcome. This is my position. It might be challenging. It might be, I don't know, debatable, but I think that we already do enough, and there is enough burden on our shoulders.
Thank you. Well said. Well said. So I wanted to actually, I wanted to wrap this. So we have about another 10 minutes, right? And this has been extraordinary. I've been really enjoying it. I hope you have. I want to bring in, so, we are a group of women talking about our experiences, our realities, and what the future holds, right? But we are building a future for younger generation, and they're absent in most of these spaces, right? And when they are present, we patronize them. And I think most women are in these spaces who are adults are guilty of that as well, right? So what I wanted to ask all three of you, what is your commitment to ensure making space for young women and young people, right? And where do you, so how do you make space, and how do you hold yourself accountable to them? So I actually want to start with Margaret on this one. Margaret, you are muted. Oh, perfect. Thank you. Sorry, you're still muted, Margaret. Margaret, you're muted.
Unmute. Now, can you hear me now?
Perfect. Thank you.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, thanks.
Oh, good. Of course. And when I think about everything that is happening now, the young people, their future now so uncertain because of COVID, the incredible young people who are showing such amazing strength and courage in their schooling, which they're, you know, not being able to go to school, not being able to go to university, not having jobs. They are absolutely amazing young people. But whilst I want to hear young people's voices, and it's really incumbent on we older people to help all those young people move up and be there, we can hear their voices. I don't want it ever to be young against old. I also have to say, I want old people also to have a voice. I'm really interested in that generation equality in which we bring it all together, and which we never write off older people as being poor, vulnerable, lonely, depressed. I've got a big thing about having proxy grandparents for unaccompanied child asylum seekers, harness all the resources that old people have to help the young people learn from that great experience that older women have, whatever they've been doing in their lives. So I'm committed to that. I'm committed to mentoring and helping young women, trying to help them with their career choices, putting them in touch with anyone, but not at the cost of not listening to older women either. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks. Thank you for that. And I think there's a lot for us to learn from indigenous communities, because I think they live what we talk, right? And I think there's a much to learn from indigenous communities across the globe in all regions, because there's a seamless way in which the elders are brought in with the young community, and that the cycle of life is not separated. Right. And with that, I want to go to Irene. Irene.
Thank you. I loved what Margaret said, and you know, and what you just said about indigenous communities. I think learning from them in all the work that one does on human rights. One of the main things that we try to do as a women human rights community in Uganda is to be led by those who walk in the shoes. So if you're working on an issue, you need to be led by the group that is directly affected, whether it's an individual client or it's a community, because they know what works for them. And I talked earlier on about the work that we did with reaching out, you know, to the labor movement, and a lot of the women in the floricultural sector in East Africa, and I believe in many countries, not just in Africa, are young. They're young, and so you by engaging with them, you're engaging with young people, with young leaders, and you can learn from them. So my commitment really is, one is to learn, is to just have an open mind and listen. And in that, you find that there's a lot that you learn, because they bring a different approach. It's the experience that they have and the lives that they have that shape their thinking, and often there's a lot one can learn from them on how to deal with issues. I engage quite a lot with the youth in my country, or I did, you know, when I was still there. So I had a whole group of young people who I linked up with, who were part of various activism. And what one can do, this mentoring, you know, that Margaret talked about, that they quite often do need and can benefit from. You can also set up programs. So my organization and others have had mentorship programs. So you can have the formal program, or you can have the informal mentoring and coaching and supporting. I think the last two things I would raise around accountability, one of them is that the world we live in today is a very stressful age. And if it's stressful for us, you know, with all the resources and networks and so on that we have, imagine how much more it is for young people, you know, for people who are impoverished by policies and so on. So the kind of support that they need also needs to you know, people who have issues, it might be mental health issues, you know, lack of social support. And in our current neoliberal system, I have a major beef with neoliberalism, incidentally. The kind of education that they receive does not equip them, you know, to survive. It just equips them to be exploited. So you know, when I went to school, we had the greens to play in, you know, the playgrounds. We had time when we had not just rote learning, but we were able to have our minds developed. We could ask questions. The teachers themselves are stressed and they're too few for the classrooms, if they are classrooms. So this is the kind of situation that young people, and then that's for the ones in school. There are many who are not even in school. So I think creating, pushing for policies and programs and resources for their needs is really important. And for me, it's about challenging global inequality. So challenging global financial systems and inequalities built into them that basically push everybody, into the 99% with nothing and hoard wealth, the wealth of all our countries for the 1%. So for me, that is the equality, to build a better world that is fairer and that's much more inclusive and that ensures that resources are distributed more fairly.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And Goha, if you can speak to this really quickly before we close, and really speak to, where are the spaces for young people and where's the accountability? Thank you.
Ooh, is Goha frozen?
Looks like,
no.
Goha, are you there?
I hope she's rejoining.
I really would.
Oh, there she is.
Okay,
Go ahead.
Goha, did you hear me?
I got disconnected, I guess, for a few seconds.
Okay, so the question is really about where in your work do you bring space, make space for young people and especially young women, and then what is the accountability to them?
Yeah, very, very important question. First of all, we support initiatives of young girls. That's what we do for the past 15 years. It's a support of girls-led and young women's-led initiatives, and also including them as much as possible in any decision-making that we're taking. We also now have, for example, adolescent girls on our board that are also part of decision making about the organization, about the decisions, like in terms of our strategies even, or grant making policies, or even financial resilience policies. Anything that we're discussing among ourselves, we're trying to encourage young women and adolescent girls to be part of this discussion. And I think that makes them more, it makes us accountable, but it also makes them more engaged in feminist values and fight for feminist values, because they see this work from within. They see everyday struggle of the local organizations, and they are committed, becoming more and more committed to the values. This is the strategy we adopted, and so far it worked well. So we are committed to continue this strategy.
Thank you very much. It's a great place for me to close and hand over to Huri, I believe. I wanted to really bring up the definition of human rights. The definition of human rights is constructing conditions in society for people to be fully human. This means that those whose humanity is threatened must decide what it means to be fully human. So a new and improved normal is not only about building back differently, it is also about living better by valuing women's work, integrating their contributions, and recognizing their well-being as fundamental to the sustainability of the people and the planet. So thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to serve as your moderator. And I believe I am moving on to Yvonne or Huri. I'm not quite sure.
I'm going to give the floor to Yvonne for the great job that she did to say thank you to you all.
Oh my gosh, I am so thrilled. I am practically speechless. Thank you, Krishanti. Thank you, Irene. Thank you, Margaret. Thank you, Gohar. And thanks to all who were here today. This has been such a wonderful discussion. And I saw somewhere in the chat where Huri and Krishanti had an exchange, and they said this conversation needs to continue. And I really believe that this conversation needs to continue at a further time, sometime in 2021. So thank you all so very much. I am speechless. Thank you, thank you, thank you.
And that's not easy for Yvonne and even me, right? Like we love giving so much accolades to all of you. But seriously, I know how hard it is to make decisions on where to attend, to give our attention and our eyes to these boxes and to these computers. So I'm very grateful that you chose us to come and engage with us. The conversation in the chats were amazing. I want to thank Gohar. It's actually my first time meeting her. I know her organization. Obviously, I'm Armenian and I have a soft spot there. You are doing a tremendous job. I know it's very late for you there, so I hope you have a good night's sleep. Krishanti, what can I say? You are amazing. Like every time you speak up and you take you know these roles, you just knock it out of the park. I want every, and of course, Irene, your presence, your knowledge, it's just an honor. And what can I say about Margaret Owen that has not been said and thought of? She's amazing. We look up to you. You will never be too old to do this. And as usual, what I would love to do is have everybody open up their cameras and their microphones and really feel each other's presence in the room. Thank you for an amazing year. We're going to be working another week to tie up some loose ends. Join us for CSW 65 Virtual Forum. Thank you, Executive Committee. Thank you to Devin, Kayla, and Olivia in our office. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And goodbye. Goodbye, everyone.
Bye bye.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks a lot.
Bye, Linda.
Bye.
Adios. Hasta luego.
Adiós, adiós.
Adios.
Hi, Rosa.
Yes.
Gohar,
Hello.
I will definitely be in touch with you. Amazing.
Sure.
Bye, Mark.
It's
Bye-bye.
so hard.
Good job, Yvonne.
Bye, thank you.
Excellent job, Yvonne. Thank you.